She had no idea that the trembling old man she stopped to comfort on a rain-soaked bench was about to change the direction of her entire life. Nobody warned her that 4 days later, a black car would pull up outside her apartment, sent by a man whose name was known in every boardroom in the country. What happened between that bench and that boardroom is the kind of story people don't believe until they hear every detail, and by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why a man worth billions chose one tired stranger over everyone else who walked past him that day. Stay with us, because this story only gets more unbelievable from here. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Claire Bennett, 24 years old, living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the edge of downtown, working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Claire had grown up watching her mother struggle the same way, counting coins at checkout lines, choosing between groceries and gas. Her father had left when she was 7, and her mother, a woman named Diane, had raised Claire and her younger brother Tyler almost entirely alone, cleaning offices at night and waitressing during the day. Claire remembered falling asleep on hard diner booths while her mother finished her shifts, and she remembered the exhaustion etched permanently into her mother's face by the time Claire turned 16. That exhaustion never left Claire's memory, and it shaped nearly every decision she made as an adult. By the time Claire graduated high school, she had already been accepted into a respected business program on a partial scholarship, and for a brief period, it seemed like her family's luck might finally be turning. But halfway through her second year, her mother's health began to decline, and the medical bills piled faster than Claire could manage alongside her tuition. She made the decision no one wanted her to make, withdrawing from school to work full-time, telling herself it was temporary, telling herself she would go back once things settled. Things never fully settled. Years passed, her mother recovered but never returned to full strength, and Claire found herself trapped in a cycle of double shifts, expired ambitions, and quiet exhaustion that mirrored the very childhood she had hoped to escape. Despite everything stacked against her, Claire never became bitter, and this was the detail that people who knew her always mentioned first. She still held doors for strangers, still gave up her seat on crowded buses, still stopped to help someone who dropped their groceries even when she herself was running late. Her co-workers at the diner used to joke that Claire could not walk past someone in trouble, even if her own house was on fire. It was this exact quality, this refusal to look away, that placed her on that rain-soaked sidewalk on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday evening, waiting for a bus she could barely afford, about to make a choice that would eventually reach all the way to the top floor of one of the most powerful companies in the country. The rain had been falling since noon, turning the sidewalk slick and grey, and Claire stood shivering under a shelter with a broken roof, counting exact change for a bus that was already 15 minutes late. Across the street, on a bench nobody ever seemed to notice, sat an elderly man in a coat too thin for the weather. He was crying quietly, the way people cry when they don't want to be seen, his shoulders curling inward as if trying to disappear into himself. Dozens of commuters passed him within arm's reach, umbrellas tilted against the wind, eyes fixed firmly on their phones or the pavement ahead. Not one of them turned their head. Claire watched him for almost a full minute before something inside her refused to let her stay exactly where she was standing. She crossed the street without a second thought, ignoring the honking cars and the rain soaking further through her jacket. When she knelt beside him, the old man flinched, as if he had forgotten what it felt like for someone to approach him with kindness instead of suspicion or impatience. His name, he told her through broken breaths, was Walter Hastings, and he had lost track of the address where his son lived, insisting over and over that he was fine, that he simply needed a moment to remember. He kept apologizing for crying in public, saying he didn't want to be a burden, saying most people simply walked past him and he understood completely why they did. Claire told him he wasn't a burden at all, and that she genuinely had nowhere she needed to be more than right there beside him. For the next hour, Claire sat with Walter in the rain, helping him retrace his memory step by step, using her cracked phone to search for landmarks he could recall from years earlier. She missed 2 buses in the process, and she never once complained or checked her watch impatiently the way so many people do when helping becomes inconvenient. Walter told her small fragments about his life as they searched, mentioning a wife he had lost years earlier, a son he did not see nearly often enough, and a career that had consumed decades of his life in ways he now quietly regretted. Claire listened without judgment, occasionally sharing pieces of her own story, the diner, her mother, her brother Tyler, careful never to make the conversation about herself. When they finally pieced together the address using a landmark Walter remembered near his son's street, Claire walked him there personally, holding his arm the entire way so he wouldn't slip on the wet pavement. At the door, his son, a man named Daniel Hastings, opened it with visible relief flooding across his face, thanking Claire over and over, offering her cash from his wallet that she firmly and politely refused. Claire simply said she was glad Walter was safe, gave a small wave, and turned to disappear back into the rain toward the apartment. She still had a considerable walk left to reach. She thought about the encounter briefly that night, then let it fade into the background of an already exhausting week, never imagining it would echo back into her life days later. What Claire did not know, and what she could never have guessed, was that Walter Hastings was not simply a confused old man who had wandered from home that afternoon. Walter Hastings was the founder and chairman of Hastings Meridian Capital, one of the largest investment firms in the country, a man whose decisions moved markets and whose name appeared in financial headlines nearly every single week. He had not been lost by accident that day. Walter had a habit few people in his life knew about, something he had done quietly for years without his security detail, without his assistants, without a single soul recognizing the billionaire hidden beneath an ordinary thrift store coat. Every few months, he would disappear into the city dressed as a forgotten old man, just to observe how strangers treated someone who appeared to have nothing left to offer them. Walter had begun this ritual 7 years earlier, shortly after his wife Louise passed away from a long illness that had drained both their savings of time together and his patience with the relentless demands of running an empire. Louise had once told him, during one of her final lucid weeks, that she worried he had forgotten what real people actually needed from one another, worried that decades surrounded by executives and assistants had hollowed something essential out of him. Her words haunted him long after she was gone, and eventually he decided to test her warning directly, walking anonymously through the very city his company had helped shape, watching to see whether ordinary kindness still existed at street level the way it once had when he was young and poor himself. He had done this walk 11 times before that particular Tuesday, sitting on benches, standing in slow-moving pharmacy lines, asking strangers for directions he did not actually need. Every single time, without exception, people had rushed past him, avoided eye contact entirely, or offered the barest minimum of help before hurrying away toward their own private urgencies. He had begun, quietly and painfully, to lose faith that genuine kindness still existed in a city that moved as fast and as coldly as this one had become. Claire was the first person in 11 separate attempts who had stopped completely, who had given her time freely without hesitation, who had asked for nothing whatsoever in return and expected nothing in return either. Walter went home that night unable to stop thinking about her. 4 days passed before Walter made his decision, 4 days during which he replayed the encounter constantly, turning it over in his mind during board meetings, during dinners he barely tasted, during the long silent hours when the penthouse felt far too large for one man alone. He instructed his assistant, a sharp and discreet woman named Renata, to track down the young stranger from the bench, giving her only a first name and a rough description of the direction Claire had walked afterward. Renata, accustomed to unusual requests from her employer, followed the trail through Daniel's account of the encounter, cross-referencing nearby diners and bus routes until Claire's full identity emerged within 2 days, far faster than Walter had expected. On a quiet Saturday morning, Claire opened her apartment door to find a man in a tailored suit holding a black envelope, asking politely if she was the young woman who had helped an elderly gentleman find his way home earlier that week. Claire, confused and slightly wary, admitted that she was, unsure what any of this could possibly mean for someone in her position. The man introduced himself as Walter Hastings's personal assistant and asked Claire to accompany him to a meeting later that afternoon, assuring her repeatedly that it was completely safe and entirely her choice whether to come at all. Claire almost said no. She had rent due, a shift to cover at the diner, and absolutely no reason to trust a stranger in an expensive suit standing uninvited at her door on a Saturday morning. But something about the sincerity in the assistant's voice, combined with the memory of the old man's grateful eyes and trembling hands, convinced Claire to take the risk. She called her manager, traded her shift with a co-worker who owed her a favor, and changed into her only decent outfit, a navy dress she had bought years earlier for a job interview that never led anywhere. She stepped into the waiting car outside, still unsure whether she was walking into an opportunity or a mistake she would spend months regretting. Her brother Tyler texted her twice during the ride, half joking that she was either about to become rich or disappear into a true crime documentary, a joke Claire did not find nearly as funny as he intended it to be. The car pulled up outside a glass tower in the heart of the financial district, a building Claire had walked past hundreds of times on her way to and from work, but never once imagined she would step inside. She rode the elevator in silence, her reflection staring back at her in the polished doors, heart pounding harder with every floor number that lit up above her head. When the doors finally opened onto the top level, she was led down a wide corridor into an office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city skyline, more space contained within that single room than her entire apartment building held combined. Behind the desk stood a man in a perfectly fitted charcoal suit, composed, commanding, unmistakably in control of everything and everyone around him. It took Claire several long seconds to recognize him as the trembling stranger from the bench. Walter smiled warmly and thanked her for coming, watching the shock ripple visibly across her face as she slowly realized the frightened old man she had comforted in the rain and the powerful executive standing before her were, impossibly, the exact same person. He explained everything patiently, the disguise, the 11 failed attempts before her, the years spent quietly watching people walk past someone who appeared to need help, and receiving nothing but indifference in return. He told her, his voice steady but sincere, that she was the only person out of everyone he had tested who had stopped completely, without hesitation, without any expectation of recognition or reward whatsoever. Claire sat frozen in her chair, overwhelmed, struggling to fully process that the frail old man she had walked home now controlled companies worth more money than she could reasonably imagine in a lifetime. Word of the meeting did not stay contained within that office for long, largely because Hastings' Meridian capital was, at that exact moment, in the middle of a tense internal restructuring involving a senior executive named Gregory Whitmore, a man who had spent the past several years positioning himself as Walter's eventual successor. Gregory viewed Walter's sudden interest in an unknown young woman from outside the company with immediate suspicion, assuming it was either a public relations stunt designed to soften Walter's reputation, or, worse, a distraction that might derail the leadership transition Gregory had spent years carefully engineering. When Renata mentioned Claire's name during a routine scheduling meeting, Gregory quietly began asking questions of his own, questions that would soon complicate Claire's entire experience far beyond anything she could have anticipated. Walter, unaware initially of Gregory's growing unease, slid a folder across the desk toward Claire, and inside it she found a full scholarship covering the business degree she had abandoned years earlier when her mother's medical bills consumed what little savings remained. Alongside the scholarship sat an offer for a paid position within the company to begin the moment she felt ready, and a personal mentorship placing her directly under Walter's own guidance rather than buried somewhere within the lower ranks of the organization. He told her plainly that this wasn't charity, and he did not want her to view it that way under any circumstances. He told her that kindness as rare and unconditional as her deserved investment, the same way he invested in anything else, he believed, carried the potential to grow into something extraordinary over time. Claire's hands trembled as she read through the documents, tears forming before she could stop them, her mind racing simultaneously through gratitude, disbelief, and a strange creeping fear that something this generous surely had to come with hidden strings attached somewhere beneath the surface. She thought of her mother, still working despite her health, and her brother Tyler, still uncertain about his own future, and for a moment the weight of everything she could finally offer them became almost too heavy to hold steady in her chest. She asked Walter directly, voice shaking slightly, why he trusted a complete stranger with something this significant after only one brief encounter in the rain. Walter's answer was simple. He said that in 7 years of searching, she was the first person who had made him believe kindness without motive still existed, and that belief alone was worth more to him than any amount of money could ever replace. Claire accepted the offer, though not without spending several sleepless nights weighing the decision carefully alongside her mother, who initially worried the entire arrangement sounded too good to be true and urged her daughter to proceed with caution. Tyler, meanwhile, was thrilled beyond words, already imagining a future where his sister's success might finally lift their family out of the constant financial strain that had defined their entire childhood. Claire began her new role within Hastings' Meridian capital 3 weeks later, starting in a modest position within the philanthropic division, while simultaneously resuming her business coursework online during evenings and weekends. She approached both responsibilities with the same quiet determination that had defined her entire life, refusing special treatment despite her unusual entry into the company, insisting on earning respect from her new colleagues through effort rather than her connection to Walter. Gregory Whitmore, however, remained unconvinced, and as weeks turned into months, his skepticism hardened into something closer to quiet hostility. He began raising concerns during executive meetings about favoritism, about optics, about the precedent Walter was setting by elevating an outsider with no formal experience into rooms most employees spent a decade trying to enter. Some of these concerns were legitimate corporate caution, and others, as Claire would later discover, were carefully calculated attempts to undermine her credibility before she could establish herself firmly enough to become a genuine threat to Gregory's own ambitions. Rumors began circulating quietly through the office, some suggesting Claire had manipulated a vulnerable elderly man, others suggesting an inappropriate relationship existed between her and Walter that had nothing to do with kindness at all. Claire heard fragments of these rumors secondhand, delivered through the careful sympathy of co-workers who claimed only to be looking out for her, and each fragment landed like a small, deliberate wound. She considered, more than once, walking away entirely, returning to the diner where at least the exhaustion was honest and the resentment predictable. But she remembered Walter's words from that first meeting, remembered the trembling old man on the bench who had needed nothing from her except patience, and she decided that abandoning the opportunity because of whispered accusations would mean allowing fear to make a decision that courage had originally made for her. She stayed, though the following months tested her resolve in ways she had not fully anticipated when she first stepped into that glass elevator. The turning point arrived during a company gala honoring Hastings Meridian's annual charitable achievements, an event Gregory had quietly arranged to include a public unveiling of donor records, timed specifically to draw attention toward Claire's scholarship as an example of reckless spending under Walter's leadership. Standing before a room full of investors, journalists, and senior executives, Gregory posed the question directly, asking Walter to justify publicly why an unproven young woman with no prior industry experience deserved resources that could have funded established initiatives instead. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, cameras subtly angling toward Walter, waiting to see how the notoriously private billionaire would respond to a challenge delivered so deliberately in front of an audience. Walter did not raise his voice, nor did he retreat into vague corporate language the way many executives might have under similar pressure. Instead, he told the room the entire story from the very beginning, the disguise, the 11 failed attempts, the rain-soaked bench, and the young stranger who stopped without knowing his name or his net worth. He explained that Hastings Meridian had spent decades measuring success through quarterly earnings and market share, yet had rarely paused to measure the character of the people making those numbers possible. He said Claire represented something the company's spreadsheets could never fully capture, and that betting on genuine character was, in his considered opinion, the safest investment a leader could ever make. The room, including several skeptical investors, broke into unexpected applause. Gregory, humiliated in front of the very audience he had hoped to impress, attempted damage control in the following weeks, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly against him. Several board members, previously undecided about the succession question, began openly questioning whether someone willing to manufacture a public confrontation to protect his own ambitions truly reflected the values Walter had spent decades building into the company's foundation. Within 2 months, Gregory departed Hastings Meridian entirely, accepting a position at a rival firm under circumstances that were, according to most internal accounts, considerably less amicable than the official announcement suggested. Claire, meanwhile, found herself unexpectedly respected by colleagues who had previously doubted her, many of whom later admitted privately that watching her remain composed under such public pressure had changed their opinion of her entirely. Over the following 2 years, Claire completed her business degree with distinction, balancing coursework alongside an increasingly demanding role within the philanthropic division she had once entered as a complete outsider. She used her position to establish a mentorship program specifically designed for young people agging out of financial hardship, modeling much of its structure on the exact kind of support she wished had existed for her own family years earlier. Walter attended the program's first graduation ceremony personally, sitting quietly near the back of the room rather than accepting the reserved seat offered to him at the front, insisting the day belonged entirely to the students rather than to any executive present. Claire's mother Diane attended as well, finally able to reduce her working hours thanks to the stability Claire's new position provided their entire family. Claire never forgot the rainy bench where this entire story began, and she made a point of returning to that exact street corner every year on the anniversary of the day. She stopped to help a trembling stranger she assumed was simply another forgotten old man. Walter continued his quiet, anonymous walks through the city occasionally, though he later admitted to Claire, during a conversation neither of them expected to become as emotional as it did, that he never anticipated finding another moment quite like that one again. He told her that Louise, his late wife, would have adored her immediately, and that some part of him believed Louise's final warning about forgetting what people actually needed had somehow guided him toward that particular bench on that particular afternoon. Their story eventually reached local news outlets, then spread further as journalists became increasingly interested in the unusual partnership between a billionaire and the young woman who had once walked him home in the rain without knowing his name. Claire remained noticeably uncomfortable with the public attention, insisting repeatedly in interviews that she had done nothing more than any reasonable person should have done for someone visibly struggling. Viewers and readers disagreed, pointing out correctly that reasonable people had walked past Walter 11 separate times before Claire finally stopped, proof that decency, however common in theory, remains genuinely rare in practice when tested under ordinary circumstances. The story inspired a noticeable, if temporary, shift in how people within that city treated strangers who appeared lost, tired, or simply overlooked on crowded streets and rain-soaked sidewalks. 5 years after that first encounter, Claire stood on the same stage where Gregory had once tried to publicly dismantle her credibility. This time accepting a promotion to lead the entire philanthropic division, she had helped rebuild from a small overlooked department into one of the company's most respected initiatives. Walter, seated in the audience, watched with the quiet pride of a man who had spent 7 years searching for proof that kindness without motive still existed in the world, and who had finally, through an unremarkable rainy Tuesday, found exactly what he was looking for. Claire closed her acceptance speech that evening with words she had repeated to herself many times over the years, words that had guided her long before she ever knew the trembling old man on the bench controlled anything more than the small, uncertain space he occupied that afternoon. She said that kindness rarely announces itself with any indication of what it might eventually become, and that the people most worth helping are often the ones who appear to have the least to offer in return. She said that she had not stopped that day expecting anything, and that the moment she began expecting something in return, the entire meaning of what she had done would have quietly disappeared. The room rose in applause, but Claire's attention remained fixed on Walter, seated quietly near the back exactly as he had been years earlier, the same man she had once mistaken for someone with nothing left to give, who had ultimately given her more than she had ever imagined possible. And somewhere across the city, on a bench still standing at that same rainy corner, their story continues to remind anyone willing to listen that the smallest act of attention can quietly reshape the entire direction of a life. If this story moved you the way it moved us putting it together, let us know where you are watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one.